Hello, everybody. Let's start today by talking about images. All right, this is the first reading review that we're going to talk about this term. It's chapter 2 in the textbook, so go ahead and read that, come back here. This is just going to help cover what some of the basic ideas are. Let's start with this idea of images. What are images? How do we use images? Well, images really relies on us to paint a picture with sensory perception, okay? So you're showing us images, you're giving sights and smells and letting us hear what's going on, sound. All of these different sensory inputs allow us to kind of paint a picture for our audience. It's really important to do this because this is how the human brain is wired to process information. We are programmed to bring in information through our senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. And all of these senses kind of work together to give us an understanding of the world that we're operating in. The same thing goes on with literature. When you're trying to create a story, your reader has to be able to experience it at some level that they can kind of process. And that's why images and imagery is so important. So let's start talking about like how we can bring these images in to kind of punch up our writing. And we're going to talk about it through figures of speech, okay? Because obviously if you're writing, you're not necessarily going to always be able to drop in an image, right? Sometimes you're going to have audiobooks which are going to provide sensory input through hearing. And how can you listen to something and still paint a picture that somebody can see visually? And it happens through figures of speech, ways that we use words, wordplay, that sort of stuff. So let's start talking about some of the main ideas that come up in the chapter. And we're going to explore a couple of things that weren't brought up in the chapter, but I think should be kind of addressed, like homonyms and homophones and stuff like that. So we'll get to that eventually. So let's start with the figures of speech that we talk about in the text. Metonymy, synecdoche, personification, metaphor, and simile. These are the biggest ones that I want to focus on for a couple of reasons. One, they're very common. And two, they have a huge impact on the way that our readers impact. They have a huge impact on the way our readers process the information and how they interact with the text. So let's talk a little bit about metonymy. This is a figure of speech where something is represented by something that's associated with it. The example that they give you is the crown, right? The crown equals, the king or the queen, right? The royal family is somebody wears a crown, right? The queen wears a crown, and the crown is symbolic of who she is, right? We can also think about it in terms in the American sense of the White House. Okay? Whenever we hear in the news, the White House says, it's not that we have a literal speaking house in Washington that's saying something. No, the White House is metonymy. The White House is representative of the president. All right? So whenever you hear the White House representative says, or the White House said, the White House's position is, well, that's because it's representative of the president. We also have these things that are known as synecdoche. All right? This is very similar in another sense. Both of these things are, representative, right? Sorry, I hope you can read that. This is getting a little smudgy. But both of these are representations of something else, right? Metonymy, when something that's associated with something else is used to represent that item or that thing. Synecdoche is when a smaller part of the whole is used to represent a larger idea. In the book, they said the hands on deck, right? So when you're talking about sailors who are going off to sea, hands represent the sailors, they represent the workers, right? The people that are working on the ship. So the hands are physical representations of the people. If we wanted to think about synecdoche in other ways, you can think about it in terms of, let's say I have a department head. All right? The head is representative of that person, right? If somebody's the head of the department or somebody's the head of state, the head is a physical piece of the body, right? That can be used as synecdoche to kind of represent that larger whole. We could also have something like in the United States of America. Right? We can say the United States of America. But we very rarely say that. We usually will shorten that to just American. All right. If I am an American, it's kind of understood. If you say, oh, he's an American, or she's an American, or they are Americans. If you're overseas and you say that, people understand, oh, that's the United States of America, right? It's not, oh, he's a North American or a South American or a Canadian, right? If you say American overseas, generally it's understood that you mean the United States of America, correct? So because of that, that smaller portion of the name, representative of the whole name of the country, that is an example of how synecdoche might work in some ways as well. So I hope that clarifies some of that. Metonymy, when something that is associated with something else is used to represent that thing. Synecdoche is when a smaller part of the whole is used to represent the big picture or the big thing. So that's the big thing. Personification. This idea of personification is one where non-human traits or non-human things are given human traits. Okay. An example of personification might be in a poem that we're going to look at, Bob Hickok's Speaking American. There is, at the end of that, there's smoke, right? And the smoke acted all floaty and sexy and better than us. And you have to think to yourself, that is smoke really able to act sexy? That's a human trait, right? But if you're saying, oh, the way that the smoke is rising, it's acting better than us, it's acting all floaty and sexy and better than us, you are giving human traits to a non-human entity. And that's an example of how personification is used to kind of punch up some writing as well. So we're going to take a look at that and some other examples in these other poems that we're going to take a look at later. Comparisons. When we make comparisons in our writing, we often will do that in terms of metaphor and simile. And these operate in similar ways as well. As a matter of fact, you can use a metaphor, and that metaphor can be turned into a simile very easily. All right? When we start thinking about metaphor, we usually think about it as a comparison between two things that don't use like or as, whereas a simile uses like or as to compare two things. So if you start thinking about metaphors, an example of a metaphor might be, she's a walking dictionary. Right? You could say the Lake Monoman, maybe not Lake Monoman, but a lake. The lake was a mirror, right? That's an example of how metaphor is kind of transmitted to us. Metaphor can very easily become a simile if you just add like or as. So if I say the lake was a mirror, I could say the lake was like a mirror. All right. The way these operate differently is with like or as, you are simply drawing the comparison about, between these two things that might not have a whole lot in common, but they might have something in common between the two of them, right? Some things that aren't really alike, but have a similar trait. Water can be mirror-like, right? You can see a reflection in water, you can see a reflection in a mirror, but water and mirrors are two very different things, right? If you use like or as, that's the simile. That's where you're focusing on that common trait that they have in common. If you have metaphor, you're almost making that one thing the other thing, right? So if I said the mirror lake, the lake was a mirror, I'm basically transforming that idea of that lake into the mirror, right? It's still using the same traits, it's still using the same commonalities, but in this one, in metaphor, it becomes more of a literal shift, whereas a simile is more of figurative, I guess, if I can kind of sum it up like that. I don't know if that's the best way to put it. That's the way I'm going to put it. So comparisons through metaphors and similes are very common in writing. The great thing about metaphor is it has this way of being more vivid in many ways, whereas if you add like as to a simile, to make it a simile, sometimes it is not quite as impactful as it could be. Okay, so that's getting started here. I'm going to clear out some of this, and then we're going to come back here. We're going to hit on hyperbole, oxymorons, puns, homonyms, and homophones. Okay, so hold on. I'll be right back. All right, so picking up where we left off, we're going to pick up with hyperbole to start out with. Hyperbole deals largely with over-exaggeration. Okay. An example of over-exaggeration that you might have in hyperbole is, oh my gosh, my mom is going to kill me. Right? That's a classic over-exaggeration that almost every teenager in America has ever spoken at some point or time. My mom's gonna, oh my gosh, I crashed the car, my mom's gonna kill me. You know, is she really? Probably not, right? If your mom was literally going to kill you, and that was not hyperbole, that would be a very interesting device to invoke in your story or something. But generally speaking, that's, you know, hyperbole. It's an over-exaggeration. It's a way of like getting across that, oh my gosh, I'm in a lot of trouble, right? That's all it is. It's just an over-exaggeration to kind of draw our attention or to, you know, engage us in some way. So over-exaggeration happens all the time. Oxymorons, those are fun. Oxymorons deal when you have contradictory terms, right? Something that appears to be a contradiction. An example could be, politically, we hear things like clean coal. All right, that's kind of an oxymoron. Coal is by nature very dirty, right? Not just in the burning of it, but the digging of it, right? If you go into a coal mine, you never see somebody go into a coal mine and come out, you know, as if they just showered, right? They always come out and they're all covered with dirt. So coal essentially is dirty. It's you know, essentially a dirty item. So clean coal is kind of an oxymoron. It's kind of a contradiction. Some other examples that you might see, open secrets. Let's see. Oh, one of my favorites. Original copies. Right? Those are oxymorons, things that are in apparent contradiction, but we hear them placed together all the time. Puns. Puns are perhaps one of my favorite things to come across in writing when it's done well. And when it's done poorly, it's kind of, you know, painful. But it's still kind of fun to play with. This deals with a play on words. One example, being an English major, being an English teacher, I kind of want to, you know, play up the clauses, right? Clauses isn't sentences and phrases and stuff. Santa's helpers are subordinate clauses, right? I don't know why. Every Christmas, this comes into my mind, and I love listening to it, right? That's subordinate clauses. Santa's helpers are subordinate clauses, right? Clauses meaning, you know, they're subordinate to the clause, right? Subordinate to Santa, and subordinate clauses being, you know, phrases and sentences. Never mind. I'm kind of geeking out on you on English there a little bit. Perhaps a better one. A better one would be reading in the sun will make you well read, right? Reading in the sun will make you well read, right? Read as in sunburnt, but well read as in you've read a lot of stuff, right? That's another example of a pun. And the reason why I wanted to use this one is because it allows us to kind of jump into this other conversation of homonyms and homophones. Essentially, just to kind of summarize that, I don't think I really did that effectively. Puns are plays on words that could mean more than one thing, all right? wordplay with multiple meanings. All right? And depending on who you are and how you read it, you might have a different meaning. This also has in it an example of a homophone. All right? Homophones are two words that sound alike but with different spelling and meaning, right? So if we think about this, red versus red. This is an example of a homophone. Two words that sound the same but appear differently, right? Different spellings, different meanings. If I used a homonym could be the same word, or the same spelling of a word, right? That has two different meanings. So if I wanted to think about caliber, right? I could say, oh, they use this in Austin Powers, right? And if you remember the first original Austin Powers movie, Dr. Evil goes, I am surprised by their calibers, or I like people of that caliber, right? Caliber meaning, the high quality of their personality, and then the size of a gun barrel being the caliber of a bullet, right? That's an example of a really bad homonym, right? Where you have the same spelling of a word, same pronunciation, but it means two totally different things, right? Playing with homonyms and homophones can be very interesting. I've done it in my own poems, and I find them to be very satisfying when you do them well. For example, I wrote a poem called Pulse, and it was about a silent morning, right? But it wasn't M-O-R, it was M-O-U-R, N-I-N-G, right? Silent morning. In silent morning or versus, think about silent morning. Most people would think about the silent morning, the beginning of the day, the sun's coming up, and that has one meaning, right? You go out to a silent morning, it's quiet, it's sunny, it's nice, there's nothing going on except for maybe the twitter of a few bugs and birds or whatever. That's a little different than when you walk into a room that's in silent mourning. That's a little more haunting. A little more divisive. I don't know, there's more stuff going on. There's something different going on in this morning versus that morning, right? So in my poem Pulse, I talk about that. I talk about, and we awoke onto a silent morning, premature death, that sort of thing. So that's an example of how homophones might come in to your writing. Using different spellings of words with different meanings, and using them in a way that's almost punny, that has more than one meaning to it, right? So if I said a silent morning noun, that's also a little bit of a pun. It could be a little bit of a pun because you could take it two different ways. Not in a comical sense in this case, but it's still kind of technically a pun nonetheless. So, I hope that helps to kind of summarize what we're talking about in chapter 2, I think it is. Talking about the images, talking about some of the wordplay and the figures of speech that are going on. If you have any questions about that, let me know. Otherwise, just continue on to number 2, video 2. We're going to talk a little bit about Speaking American, that specific poem. We're going to go searching for some of these things in Speaking American. And then we are going to move on into voice and some other things for this week. So happy writing, happy reading, and I will see you guys all online.